You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Hello, world, and welcome to Tales from Hollywoodland, a veritable feast of movies, television, Broadway, showbiz stories, news and gossip, with Julian Schlossberg, Arthur E. Friedman, and Stephen Jay Rubin. Today, we look at Deep Throat and other X-rated movies. And on top of that, we're joined by author Jared Stearns, and we talk about his book, Pure, The Sexual Revolution of Marilyn Chambers. And now, here's Arthur.
Hello, everybody. Today, we're going to talk about a historic film called Deep Throat, which somewhat revolutionized the movie business. And before we get into it, want to mention the fact that what most people don't know about Deep Throat is how big it was at the box office. We all know about Avatar and Titanic and Godfather and so many big hit movies. And I think if there were a list of the top 50 hit movies, it would shock people to know that Deep Throat may have been one of the top 50. That's how big it was. Having said that, it came out in 1972, and I think all of us here on the show, Steve and Julian, and maybe Mike and Jared, are familiar with the fact that every movie that comes to be gets pitched. It has to get pitched to the studio, to the financing entity, but the questions at the pitch meeting are always the same. They usually have to be involved with what's it about, how much they're going to cost, who's the director. And sometimes a fellow I knew who was one of the studio heads, he had a great question at these meetings. What's the hook? What's the hook in the movie? Well, the hook in Deep Throat may be the most outstanding hook in the history of movies. Because when they asked that question, the answer had to come back. The hook is, it's about a woman who cannot achieve orgasm and goes to the doctor to find out why, and he finds her clitoris in her throat. That would sell, I think. You know, the next question after that is, how much will it cost? But that was the hook of Deep Throat. And it went on to, as I say, do record business. And there's so many stories that go with that. Some of which will be told here by Julian and Steve, and certainly by Jared. Julian, I'd like to pass it on to you and hear what your thoughts are on Deep Throat.
Well, we know that it really did change the movie business in many ways. And in the same year, I'm sure Jared covers this, Behind the Green Door came out. And that was a big year, the 72, as far as the porn business. Those were two gigantic films. And Jared, I'd like to ask you, I gather Marilyn was, if you'll forgive the quote, mentored by the Mitchell brothers, I would imagine. And that's how she, of course, we can go into forgive me, just quickly. I interviewed the comic Robert Klein. He's in The Owl and the Pussycat. He's in bed with a girl. The girl he's in bed with is Marilyn Chambers in The Owl and the Pussycat. How's that for trivia? But you knew it, Jared, didn't you?
I did, yes. I again will apologize to your listeners because I have a bit of a cold. So
can I jump in and ask Jared real quickly a little bit about your background?
Sure.
I mean, I would love to know how you came to write Pure, and tell us a little bit about where you come from.
Sure. So I'm based in San Francisco. I'm originally from the East Coast, the Boston area. But I first discovered Marilyn Chambers in the 90s when I was about 13, and I went snooping in my grandfather's dresser drawer for adult material. And I found it in the form of a video cassette called Marilyn Chambers Private Fantasies #2, which was the second volume in a 6-volume direct-to-video series. And I watched it, and there was something about her. I didn't know the term star quality, but that's what it was. And I would hear her name referenced on television shows in the 90s, usually as a punchline. And people would laugh, but it occurred to me even then, wow, this woman must have been really famous for her name to be bandied about so casually that everyone knows her as a cultural touchstone. And it even occurred to me then, when I was a teenager, that's unusual for someone who makes an adult film to be that famous. And back in 2011, here in San Francisco, they did a retrospective of hardcore films shot in the city in the 60s and 70s, because San Francisco was known as the smut capital of America. That was the term the New York Times gave to us in 1970. And I went because they were showing Resurrection of Eve, which came out in 1973, right after Behind the Green Door. And Marilyn did that with the Mitchell brothers. And I went purely out of my fondness for her. And something similar happened in that theater that happened when I first saw her on video cassette, which was just this magnetism that she had. And I thought, I need to find out everything I can about this woman. And now, 13 years later, here's a book about her, the first and probably the only book about Marilyn Chambers.
Thank you for that. That's so interesting. Was it a tough book to sell? I would not think so.
It was absolutely a tough book to sell. Yes. Oh yeah. Because we were turned down by all the major U.S. Publishers because the publishing industry is very stuffy and uptight. And of course, you would think the aphorism "sex sells" is true, and it is. But when you add the word porn in there, that brings up a lot of conscious and unconscious feelings and opinions about that one has. And so we ended up going with a smaller publisher out of the UK, which doesn't surprise me because they're a little bit more open in talking about that. But we found it the right home. They really wanted the book. And so far it came out this past April. And so far it's doing well. It's actually a favorite of John Waters, who called me and told me how much he liked it and mentioned it on Real Time with Bill Maher. So that was really cool.
I'm still trying to get by the smut capital of America. That's very good. Because the fact of the matter is that what was proven with Deep Throat is that movie crossed over into the mainstream. Yes. And did business all over America and in small towns. Now, I owned a lot of movie theaters in those days, and we avoided the picture for reasons that we were concerned about. Not certain so much making money because it made lots of money. We were concerned about the legal problems that were involved with it, and there were legal problems. We had represented a theater owner in Ridgefield, Connecticut, who actually played it in Ridgefield, broke his house record on the Wednesday night when it opened, and was in jail on Friday. They arrested him for reasons of whatever. But those are the things. The fact of the matter is that Deep Throat killed him in small town America, where you think it's the Bible Belt or whatever. Well, there is no such thing in America in terms of movies. People love the same stuff. So Deep Throat was a huge, huge hit. Marilyn Chambers, how old was she when she did the movie?
She was 19 when she made Behind the Green Door. She was 20 by the time it came out. It came out 2 months after Deep Throat, and Deep Throat premiered at the World Theater in New York City, whereas Behind the Green Door premiered in San Francisco. And really, those were the two areas where the most X-rated films were made and shown. But to your point, Deep Throat was just this major film that did revolutionize the film industry. And there were a lot of legal problems associated with screening that film at any type of theater. And theater owners were thrown in jail. And some of the Marilyn certainly testified before California state Supreme Courts about what's obscene and what isn't. But it's really, those films helped drive really complex conversations about what is okay to be shown on film and what isn't. But celebrities were lining up to see Deep Throat. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis was in line, Johnny Carson, and then they would talk about it, and
it had a life. It found its own life. That happened.
Yeah, they call that era porno chic, and it only lasted for about a year and a half. But that's when porn was seen by mixed gendered audiences. So women would go to see them, older women. It wasn't just the raincoat crowd, the old guys who would go to see it. Couples went to see it. My dad went to see it in the 70s when he was, like in his early 20s, and I think, newly married to my mom. So it became a thing, a talking point, a dinner conversation, and everyone had to go see them. And Behind the Green Door was even entered into was screened at the Cannes Film Festival, the first time they ever allowed a hardcore film to be screened there, and it screened to rave reviews. And if you watch either Deep Throat or Green Door, they're not like X-rated films that are made today. They have plots, they have characters. And it's very, very unusual. Green Door.
We saw the how should I say, the preface, the backstory, if you will, to Deep Throat in the 60s in the theater business. Julian, you will recall probably pictures like I Am a Woman, soft porn that led up to Deep Throat. So Deep Throat was at kind of like the end of this explosion. And those pictures were also doing business in small towns. Those were not great days for the movie theater business. So they were playing, I a Woman or other things. I don't know, Curious Yellow, whatever these things may be. They all led up to Deep Throat. Little bonus on Deep Throat too was the girl's name was Linda Lovelace. It was a very good, catchy name like Mickey Mantle, Walt Disney, certain catch names. Willie Mays in San Francisco.
Did you actually mention Walt Disney in the same breath as Linda Lovelace?
Well, I bet you he may have seen the movie too.
Probably did.
Yeah.
Actually, no, he was dead by 66.
The film might have got to him. Anyhow, the most important thing to remember is that 72, those two movies of Beyond the Green Door and Deep Throat was followed by what many people consider the best porn movie ever made, called The Devil and Miss Jones. And The Devil and Miss Jones, Roger Ebert gave it 3 stars. Most people think that's the best one ever made. But those 3 movies coming, if you'll forgive the expression, coming in a row, really ended up changing, as Arthur said, the whole exhibitor pattern. A lot of exhibitors who were afraid took the chance. Often, the people booking it weren't arrested. It was the poor manager and the projectionist who they got. They didn't even get the people who actually booked the movie most of the time.
In Ridgefield, Connecticut, they got to the owner.
Oh, that was something.
He was sick and tired. He said he was sick and tired of playing these movies that were not doing business. Get me Deep Throat. And I said to this guy, he was a funny guy, Harry. I said, Harry, I can't get you Deep Throat. I'll give you the phone number to call, and you take it from there. So he did. He called up. He said, this is great. I got this movie. It's going to kill him. The next day he called you. It did $6,000. It's unbelievable. It's bigger than any week I've had just on Wednesday. And the next day he calls, Arthur, I'm in jail.
The next call was Arthur, get me a lawyer. He had the
Yeah,
lawyer.
my question is, 3 years before Deep Throat, John Schlesinger directs Midnight Cowboy, which was released with an X rating. I'm wondering if Midnight Cowboy, in its own way, opened the door for these kinds of films, because obviously, even though Midnight Cowboy is hardly a pornographic movie, it had certain elements which were deemed X-rated. But I'm wondering if, and that was, of course, the beginning of the end of the rating system, or the introduction of a new rating system. I'm wondering what impact that movie may have had. What do you think?
Well, I worked for United Artists we had Midnight Cowboy. That rating was one of the great absurdities in the history of the motion picture business. It never should have been an X, and it should have been an R, and had really nothing to do with the kind of thing that we're talking about here with Jared. It had nothing to do with Behind the Green Door.
It had no effect, in my opinion, whatsoever on what we're talking about. What I would like to ask is let's talk about Ivory Snow and the Mitchell brothers, Jared. Give us some history on that, please.
Yeah, so the Mitchell brothers, Art and Jim Mitchell, came from a town called Antioch, which is in the Bay Area, and they decided they needed to make money. Jim went to film school a little bit, and they decided to open their own theaters in San Francisco because they wanted to retain the money. They didn't want to make films and then have them screened at theaters owned by other people. They wanted to retain all the money. And these really were, it was the businesses, their flagship location is actually just down the street from my apartment. The O'Farrell Theater. It was a family affair. So like the wives would sew the curtains, and there was a suggestion box in the lobby. And the Mitchell brothers were very, very smart marketers. So they knew that they were going to be raided by the police. So they decided to make it a really classy place because that's the image they wanted to project. And after making 300 something loops in the late 60s, they wanted to do a feature film, and they decided to do Behind the Green Door. And Marilyn Chambers she answered an ad in the San Francisco Chronicle. She went down. It said nothing about being a hardcore film. She went down. They thought she was perfect for it. She was hesitant, and she tried to get out of it by saying she wanted an obscene amount of money, like $25,000 and 10% of the gross, not the net, the gross. And the brothers said, yeah, don't call us, we'll call you. And but they did call her about an hour later, and they said, we're going to give you everything you want. And so she was very stubborn and said, okay, I'll do it. And, she was 19. The film came out in August of 72 in San Francisco, and it did play in New York at a couple of theaters that the Mitchell brothers had good relationships with. But it really didn't blow up until May of 73. And that's when Marilyn received the second half of a payment from Procter & Gamble, which was the consumer packaged goods manufacturer. They're still around, which made Ivory Snow laundry detergent, which isn't much of a thing anymore, but it sure was back then. Everyone had Ivory Snow, and it was marketed towards mothers because it was soft enough to wash a baby's clothes in. And the tagline was 99 and 44 100% pure. And Marilyn had taken the photo a few years before when she was about 17, holding a smiling baby. And she told the Mitchell brothers about this, that the box was coming out. And they very wisely sat on the story. They said, we're going to wait, because they knew a product recall would be way too expensive, even for Procter & Gamble. But if they pulled the trigger too early, Procter & Gamble might have time to pull the boxes off the shelves, and they didn't want that. And so it finally blew up in May of 1973. And you hear the famous overnight, became famous overnight. She really did. No one really knew who Marilyn Chambers was on May 2nd, 1973. But on May 3rd, 1973, when the wires picked up the news story, internationally, everyone knew the name Marilyn Chambers. And because Deep Throat was so successful, the timing, you couldn't have perfected it any better. It was just one of those moments in time in American history that probably will never be again, and Marilyn Chambers was at the center of it.
So she had what you consider to be the it factor.
Yes. Yeah. I even make the comparison in my book to, Clara Bow, the it girl, and that she had it.
Where was she from, Jared?
She was from Westport, Connecticut, and she grew up, which is an affluent suburb, and her dad was a Madison Avenue executive, so a literal madman, like the TV show. And he would like many other people, would take the train from Westport to New York City every day. She had an older brother and sister, and they were considered upper middle class. And Westport is very fancy now. And
it was then, too.
Yeah, Paul Newman, I think, lived there for a while, and
Rod Serling.
Yeah, okay, I didn't know that one, Rod Serling. And she always wanted to be an actress, and she would go into New York, but she thought, I need to be a model first. That was her rationalization of becoming an actress, and she was a model first, but she was way too wholesome for high fashion runway modeling. So she did the Sears and Roebuck catalog, and she did Pepsi commercials and Clairol. And she got a non-speaking role in The Owl and the Pussycat with Barbra Streisand and George Segal, and played Robert Klein's girlfriend. But that got her Screen Actors Guild card. And she thought she was on her way. And she was sent out to San Francisco and LA on a publicity tour by Ray Stark, the producer. And he I'll leave what he said for people to read about, because I don't want to give the whole book away. But
give us a hint. Can you give us a hint, please?
Sure. She thought it would be, she was going there just for a publicity tour. He had other ideas in mind.
Understand.
Yeah. So she was really disillusioned, but she fell in love with San Francisco. So as soon as she got back to New York, she said, I'm moving west. And that's what she did.
Now, excuse me, my naivety, because I don't know Marilyn's background very well. You mentioned the Ivory Snow thing earlier. What actually happened when the film came out? What was the reaction of Procter and Gamble?
Oh, they were so embarrassed. And they said, we're canceling her contract. But they didn't right away, because so many people went out to buy the box. And they found, we're making money off of this. And so even though outwardly, and they were embarrassed because they had no idea, because she had taken it 2 years before, the photo, and she couldn't have known, and they couldn't have known. She took the most important photo of her career then. Behind the Green Door wasn't even in her mind then. And so they were very embarrassed and said, we're canceling her contract. They quietly extended it and paid her more money, and because they made more money off of it. And they did eventually in 74. So they let it go about a year. And they replaced her photo with a sketch, not a photo. And they added something, which I don't know if it's still in modeling contracts, but it's in the industry known as the Marilyn Chambers clause, where you cannot have appeared in an X-rated film or have appeared in any sort of pornographic films if you're, hawking a product for Procter and Gamble or other consumer packaging.
If they had that years before, they would have had Claudia Colbert, they would have had Joan Crawford, and others. What happened to Marilyn Chambers subsequent to Behind the Green Door?
So she became mega famous, and she made one more film with the Mitchell brothers, Resurrection of Eve, and she wanted to be an actress. And she wanted to be known as a serious actress, and she got offers, but nothing really was happening. And then she got a phone call from a man named Chuck Traynor, who was married to and managed Linda Lovelace of Deep Throat. And they had divorced, Linda and Chuck had lined up all of these Las Vegas cabaret gigs and acts and all that stuff. And Marilyn wanted to be an all-around entertainer. And she took up with Chuck, married him, let him manage her career for about 10 years. It was a very volatile marriage and relationship. He was the type who was very polarizing. You either liked him or you didn't. Most of the people I talked to did not like him. Only one person liked him. And she did stage theater. She did dinner theater. She did.
But if I could interrupt a second, I believe she worked with David Cronenberg in the movie Rabid.
Yes.
That in fact, I remember reading years ago that she said she learned more about acting with Cronenberg than all the years she had been acting. Is that true? Was that all?
Yeah, that is true.
Can that be substantiated by you?
Yes, and it was substantiated by David Cronenberg because I interviewed him for my book. So she did all of this cabaret stuff. She did an off-Broadway musical, and she was supposed to work with Nicholas Ray and Norman Mailer and Rip Torn in a film called City Blues, but that fell apart because of tax shelter laws in New York. And then finally she took a role in a horror film called Rabid. It was David Cronenberg's second feature film. It was funded in part by the Canadian government, and she went up to Montreal to film it, and it was a hit, and it got her good notices, but it still did not get her the type of acclaim that she so desperately wanted, which was to be a serious actress. But it's a big cult film, and of course he's a big cult director and has a following, but she acts in that, and she's quite good. And he flatly told me the only reason he was talking to me, because that film was 45 years old plus, that he enjoyed working with her so much and really, really cared for her, and said it was a sweet, professional relationship. And she worked very hard and did a great job. And his first choice was Sissy Spacek for that role, and she had not yet done Carrie, but she was in Badlands, Terrence Malick's Badlands. But that was nixed by the producers, and one of the producers knew Marilyn Chambers was trying to cross over into the mainstream. And
Jared, excuse me, how much did you study the history of Deep Throat before you wrote your book? And how much do you know about Deep Throat? Because that was kind of like the daddy of them all.
Yeah, it was. It's the most famous X-rated film ever made.
Right.
I mean, even people, but so I talk a lot about, well, not a lot, but there's been much written, and there's Deep Throat documentaries and lots of stuff. But I can't talk about Marilyn Chambers without talking about Deep Throat. So there's a whole section in the book about Deep Throat and all the legal problems. Also, the Mafia. The Mafia, in part, funded a lot of these films that were made, including Deep Throat.
Julian and I are well aware of that. Being theater owners and film distributors at the time, we got to know the Porno brothers in different ways. And,
yeah, there you go. Yeah,
we knew them. I knew a fellow in Connecticut. I'll tell you a fast story, and I would love to pass it on to Julian to talk about his relationship with one of the Porno brothers. But one of the fellows who was a minor investor in Deep Throat had a home in Connecticut. And so at the time I was working for United Artists, was sales manager in the state of Connecticut. I got a call from my the branch manager, and he says, while you're down there, there's this fellow named Herb, and I won't mention his last name, and he owes us about $12,000. He owns some drive-ins in New York State. So he said, could you stop over and hand him a bill and see if he can collect the money? Oh, sure. See, it sounded easy. I go to his house in the Westport area, one of those towns in Norwalk or one of those things. And I knock on the door, a nice house, and the girl who answers the door is in a negligee. And she might as well have been a movie star. She was fantastic, okay? She was Herb's wife. And I'm here to see Herb. I sit down, and he, good-looking guy with some gray hair, comes out, got like a pot belly, and he's sitting there. He says, what's up? What can I do for you, kid? I said, well, I'm here. I'm here, so I just brought a bill. If you could, possibly give me a check. When I said that, he went, oh, my back is killing me. Oh, my God, Sheila, get me the medicine. So that calmed down. And he said, so what else do you do, kid? What else? I said, well, I do this, I do that. Where do you live? I live in Boston. Oh, where about? Blah, 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 blah. And I said, excuse me, but I was told, could you possibly just pay me the money that's owed to you? Oh, my back. It was terrible. He was one of the investors, and his wife kept coming by me half out of her negligee. It was bizarre. I never left there with a penny. So when I spoke to the branch manager, he said, do you get the money? I said, no, but it was a hell of an afternoon. I swear to God. Get the guy some back lotion and get a whatever. But
yeah.
I never.
Only in the 70s, right?
Yeah.
Well, I will bet that he paid, because those boys collected. Nobody that I know ever stiffed them, because they'd become a stiff if they stiffed them.
Well, yes, but no, he wasn't. The money was charged to him for other movies of United Artists in his New York drive-ins. That's what I was there to collect. Right. But if you didn't stiff them. Right. Are you kidding? You play Deep Throat, guys. Let me just tell you. I don't know if you know this, Jared. If you play Deep Throat as an exhibitor, the deal was 25%, which is the minimum amount of you pay distributors. 25%, when others were getting 50 or 60, or whatever it was for the movies they had, you'd pay them 25%. But the hook was you had to pay them on Thursday night after the week's business, and you had to pay them in cash. That's the story, and you needed to pay them in cash. It was a rough thing if you didn't. So that's part of the story. Julian, please.
They had a company. They formed a company called Bryanston Films. Lou Pereno, and he ran it, and he was on 9th Avenue, his offices, and I would visit there because they had they didn't just play Deep Throat. I mean, they decided to go into production, and they actually made a couple of movies. One of them was called The Devil's Reign. You guys remember that at all?
Oh, wasn't John Travolta in that? A very young John Travolta.
John Travolta's first.
Ernest Borgnine.
That was his very first movie. But if you look at the cast, it was all names that used to be Ernie Borgnine, Ida Lupino, Eddie Albert, William Shatner. They're all in this movie. but Bryanston made it, and they did okay with it. But let's get back to Marilyn. Marilyn, we are told on the marquee, is Marilyn Chambers is insatiable. She's insatiable.
Yes. She's insatiable. Yes.
And I would say, am I right in assuming that was her second biggest movie?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, it kind of eclipsed Green Door. It's her favorite of all of her X-rated films, and it came out, again, the timing couldn't have been better. It came out in 1980. The home video boom was starting, and so was cable television. And she made this film, Insatiable, in Northern California, which played at the Pussycat Theaters and other X-rated houses. But it did better on video. So it was the highest grossing home video of any genre from 1980 to 1982. And she and the producers and director, they made millions, tens of millions of dollars on that. And the Mafia was involved in that production. And I don't know what cut they got, but she did really well. And that is probably, it's as famous as Behind the Green Door, for sure.
She did very well, or did her husband do very well, or did both of them do very well?
Well, good question. Yeah. So her husband was, he sort of handled all the money, and she never wanted for anything, but he insisted that, she always wear furs and they go out in limos and all that stuff. So he controlled all of the money. And when they finally broke up after 10 years of marriage, he would only give her a divorce or agree to it if she said she gave him 50% of everything she earned for 5 additional years after they divorced. And then she was free. But by then she had aged out of certainly porn and in many ways the entertainment industry. She was, really burnt out with what she did because she had an incredible run. So she struggled with finances in the later part of her life. But then she married and became a mom and all that stuff. So, but she was certainly gypped a lot during her career.
Well, one of the ways she seems to have been gypped, I think, didn't they make these movies like Inside Marilyn Chambers and these kind of films from outtakes and stuff that she got nothing for? Is that true?
Yeah. So Inside Marilyn Chambers came out in 1976, and that was the Mitchell brothers. And they only did it because she bailed on them for Chuck Traynor, and they were hurt. And so it was sort of a revenge tactic. She was still getting residuals from Green Door and Resurrection of Eve, but she didn't own the copyrights for those. They did. So they put together outtakes of Resurrection of Eve and Behind the Green Door, and she begged them not to release it because she didn't want she was trying to shake the porn star label. And she knew if another X-rated film came out, it would not do her any favors. But she finally agreed. They came to an agreement with Marilyn and the Mitchell brothers. She agreed to promote the film as long as she got a cut of that film too. And right. That film did, it was not a huge blockbuster, but it did well enough. But it's not a good film, and it's false. It's supposed to be a documentary about her life. There's not a single true fact in there about her.
What did you learn? What did you learn that you found very surprising? What was the big surprises that you found? Do you remember that?
I've been asked that. And, a lot of it's not so much surprise as I heard rumors for many, many years about her relationship with Chuck Traynor, if it was violent, if it was abusive. And I did get confirmation from people who saw it firsthand. And so that wasn't surprising so much as it was disheartening that I was able to confirm that. And he was just a bad guy. I spent essentially more than a decade researching her, so that none of it came as a huge surprise. I wish I had a better answer for that.
Given the challenge of writing a biography of a star who you don't have access to, was there some video or audio interview material with her that you could tap into?
Yeah, fortunately, she gave hundreds, if not thousands, of interviews for all in every medium. So she did television, radio, film, print magazines, newspapers. So there's a lot of material, and I really tried to put it in her own words. So I'm fortunate in that respect. But yeah, I mean, she died 15 years ago, and she took with her many stories and many secrets, and which is a shame because that would have added a lot more. But fortunately, and she was very honest and very outspoken. Fortunately, she gave many interviews where she said exactly how she felt and about certain things and about her career. So that helped a lot.
One of the interesting things, guys, that happened historically from the softcore of the 60s theatrically into the Deep Throat and Beyond the Green Door and Devil and Miss Jones was anyone who was in the business at that time, myself included, we all knew this would evolve sooner or later into mainstream movies, hot sex. And somewhere in the early 70s along came The Last Tango in Paris. And then there were other movies that would come and use, hot sex as never used before. That kind of began with these movies that we're talking about here. But you ever see Don't Look Now? I mean, there's a number of movies, Body Heat, that became big business. And it was unfortunate that Marilyn Chambers, was never able to be a star in the so-called legitimate or big-time films of that genre.
That's her biggest regret is she, not for lack of trying. She tried very hard to make that transition, and in a way she did, because she was covered in movie magazines and newspapers like any other celebrity. She was mega famous. Everyone knew who she was in the 70s and 80s in particular, and she was really good friends with Sammy Davis Jr. He would invite her over for parties, and there she'd be, chatting with Frank Sinatra and all that stuff. And everyone knew who she was. And they didn't give her, producers or directors or whoever, didn't give her a chance because she was a quote unquote porn star.
Jared, she could have so easily been like a Sharon Stone in Basic Instinct.
I know. I think she should have because her real name is Marilyn Briggs, and I think after she took up with Chuck, she should have rebranded herself and as to be taken a little more seriously. But they didn't do that, and that's just the nature of her story. And there's now a new horror movie called Maxine with Mia Goth, all about a porn star from the 70s, and it's the 80s now, and she wants to make a transition to mainstream films. So people are still making movies about.
What was the movie? I think it was Star 80. Was it Bogdanovich did that, or?
Yeah, about Dorothy Stratton.
Yes. Playboy. Oh.
Yeah.
Well, one of the early, even before the so-called golden age of porn, there was a fellow who became pretty famous the end of the 50s with a brand new movie called The Immoral Mr. Tease. The Immoral Mr. Tease, believe it or not, Arthur, was Russ Meyer's first movie. He had been a cameraman, and he came up with this idea to have some full nudity with women. And it really did change a lot. It started probably the first above ground picture that got played in at least certain theaters. It was quite interesting. They claimed to make it for $24,000. They claimed they did over $1 million, but it's possible. Those kind of films at that time were really quite something. Did you get into anything with Russ Meyer, Jared, or you didn't bother with that?
I don't talk about him that much in the book. I'm personally familiar with his work. I love Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, just as a camp masterpiece.
Wasn't that written by Roger Ebert?
It sure was. Yeah.
It sure was.
Yeah. So I mean, there's so much to it. It's just such a great film.
Jared, I represented Russ Meyers in New England.
Okay.
In so-called distribution when my company was in that business. We represented all of the independent producers and distributors and what have you. So Russ I got a call one day. Russ wanted me to come out from Boston, where we were based. By the way, where are you from in Boston?
I'm from Waltham.
Okay. Brandeis.
Yes.
So I go out to meet Russ Meyer, and I meet him at an Italian restaurant on Ventura Boulevard, and we're having a nice dinner. And he's drinking some stuff. And he says, come over here, come close to me. I want to come close. Okay. And I came close to him. He said, do you know what the secret of life is? I don't think I do, Russ. He says, have another sip of wine. And I took a sip of wine. He said, the secret of life, I'm going to give it to you. You'll never forget it, okay? This is like 1974, 75. I said, okay, I'm ready. What is it? He said, big tits. That's it. That's the whole secret. The girl's got big tits. She's fine. And if a guy they want, that's it. That's the whole secret. And everything he made had big tits.
Yeah, he loved big-breasted women.
Yes.
Well, that's why he couldn't work with Audrey Hepburn.
No.
Among many other reasons, by the way. But you know the thing about Russ Meyer, guys, you know what's so interesting about Russ Meyer? Albert Zugsmith, who we all know, who, by the way, produced a lot of fine movies. Rosemary's Baby is one of them. But if you look up his career, he did a lot of great movies until I guess he met Mamie Van Doren. But anyhow,
I love Mamie Van Doren. Yeah. Yes. Love her.
He produced a Russ Meyer movie called Fanny Hill. And Fanny Hill was another X-rated movie based on the public domain book Fanny Hill. But I don't think anyone would believe if I tell you who co-starred in that movie.
Who?
Miriam Hopkins.
Oh, wow.
Miriam Hopkins, who worked
totally
in 3 movies with Ernst Lubitsch, is now doing this movie. It just shows you the vicissitudes, the difficulty it is to be an actor in this business. That woman is now doing Fanny Hill. She was nominated for an Academy Award. She played Becky Sharp. And now she's doing this movie. But she and Meyer got along very well, and he had terrible troubles with Zugsmith. But he really, I think, started what obviously became much bigger. He didn't show what they were showing in the movies we're talking about. But it's interesting. Marilyn Chambers was in a couple of car accidents, and wasn't she bad? Some bad ones?
That was Linda Lovelace.
Oh, Linda Lovelace.
Yeah,
I got my porns mixed.
I know, okay. It happens.
Yeah. But she did die of a brain aneurysm, didn't she?
She did, yes.
That's
she died at the age of 56, quite young. So, but if you look at Deep Throat, Linda Lovelace has a giant scar up her torso, which is from a car accident, a serious car accident that she got into when she was in her teens, early 20s. So, and then she got in another one in her later life, and that's eventually what killed her. She lost too much blood or got an infection or something. But Marilyn, okay, so you asked me what surprised me. I did not know this. When Linda Lovelace was in a car accident and she had to have a liver transplant or something, Marilyn sent her family money. And here's another fun fact. Marilyn Chambers and Linda Lovelace never met in real life during their lifetimes, even though they're the 2 most famous porn stars. There was no such thing as a porn star before Linda Lovelace and Marilyn Chambers. They never met, even though they shared a husband.
They were a dynamic duo. And today, when you're seeing Godzilla meets King Kong, it could have easily been Linda versus, But there was another seminal movie at that time in that area that was called Emmanuel, which kind of really legitimized soft porn, if you will, because Deep Throat, we would all agree, is a seminal movie. Emmanuel got into that real mainstream, big time, and they must have made 10 or 12 of those things. But it became a real business. But there was any number of those films from that. Was Marilyn Chambers the biggest star of that genre?
She was. Linda Lovelace is better known because of Deep Throat, and Linda Lovelace became an anti-porn crusader in the 80s when she released a memoir. So, of course, the American public loves that, and she hooked up with Gloria Steinem, who became a vocal supporter of her. But Linda Lovelace eventually went back to adult films, which many people neglect to mention. So this industry that she excoriated in front of Congress, she eventually went back to. So Marilyn Chambers, in my opinion, is the most famous porn star of all time. And Linda Lovelace is certainly there, but she only made Deep Throat and Deep Throat 2 and a non-X-rated film, and that's it. So Marilyn did a lot more.
Jared, what's your thoughts on a movie called Boogie Nights?
Yeah, so I personally, I like the movie a lot. Marilyn hated the movie. She said it was not representative of her experience, although it probably was very representative of others' experiences. I know it's based in part on John Holmes, with whom she worked in 2 films, Insatiable and Up and Coming. And so I love the film as cinema, but she didn't live that kind of life. She didn't have, that, not that she didn't have drug problems and all that stuff. She did, but it wasn't as over the top and hedonistic as Boogie Nights. So she said.
Steve mentioned Midnight Cowboy, and it reminds me of a friend of mine who was one of the biggest porn distributors in the country, who would call me occasionally and say, "What do you think of this title?" And the one he called me on, I remember first, was Midnight Plowboy.
They would always do that, yeah.
And then after that, I had so much fun with him because I guess if I laughed a lot, he would do it. But, Steve, he even came up with For Your Thighs Only.
Of course.
That's a great one.
That's a layup.
A couple of more, and then I'll give up on the titles.
Okay.
Romancing the Bone, My Bear Lady, Oregon Trail. Anyhow, and the final one is Saving Ryan's Privates.
Okay.
Big hit.
So, Jared, Marilyn was somewhat taken care of, as you've mentioned, but I get the impression that Linda Lovelace did not benefit from the huge success of Deep Throat.
No, not at all. She only made, no one knew that it was going to make that much money. No one knew they were making a seminal film in cinematic history. No one knew that. So she only made, several, it varies. Like she said, $1,200, she said $250. It's unclear, but what is clear is that she didn't make a lot of money from it. And unlike Marilyn Chambers, who was shrewd and upfront, asked for a percentage of the gross, which helped sustain her for many years, Linda Lovelace didn't do that. And then she dropped out of public view in about 1974. But one thing that we didn't talk about with Deep Throat is that it came out in June of 1972, and then in July of 1972 was the Watergate break-in. And Woodward and Bernstein follow that story, and there was their anonymous source was on Deep Background, and the Washington Post, one of the editors, not Ben Bradley, nicknamed him Deep Throat, and that has kept it in the public consciousness. And personally, had that not happened, I don't know if Deep Throat would still be talked about in such a way, because it is a terrible film. It's just not. It's not good.
It's a great point you make. But I will say this: that Linda Lovelace didn't make any money, but boy, did she become famous.
Oh, yes.
That name helped everybody, the great name. And the other thing was that, talk about water cooler conversation. Deep Throat was the biggest thing that ever happened around the water cooler. Hey, it's about this girl, and you wouldn't believe it. It's what's in a throat and blah, blah, blah. So, it formed a life of its own. And it was like lightning in a bottle, and it became
or lightning in the throat.
Yeah,
that's right. Good one, Steve.
I became friendly with Radley Metzger, who made a lot of softcore movies, and then he went a little hardcore. Decided not to use his name and went under the name Henry Harris, and his big film was the opening of Misty Beethoven. And those kind of films. In fact, he ended up having a retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art, which I was rather shocked at. But I guess that's what happens. It becomes that point where it's so above the ground. We didn't discuss another big movie of the 70s called Debbie Does Dallas.
Yep.
And Debbie Does Dallas was another very big movie. The girl who starred in it was named Bambi Woods, who disappeared from the planet. There were sightings in Des Moines, Iowa, but no one really knows if she's around or not around. But that was a very big film. You remember that, Arthur?
Of course, I remember Debbie Does Dallas, and there was another movie that was called Debbie, the first Jewish porn film, Debbie Does Nothing. But that's an old joke. It's not mine. It's not mine. I'm just communicating it from somebody else.
Speaking of other films, I decided just to do a little research as to when was the first porn film, or when was the first film that was considered to be censorable. And I looked up, the French, of course, were renowned for their rather liberal attitudes towards show business. I mean, they had the can-can, which was scandalous back in the 1880s. But in 1896, a 7-minute short film came out, Le Coucher de la Marie. And that was the same year that you had Fatima's Coochie Coochie Dance, featuring Fatima the belly dancer with some very risque moves. And as Julian knows, there is the movie that featured the very first kiss ever featured in entertainment. It was called The May Irwin Kiss. And it was the first time a kiss was featured on film. I mean, this is in the 1890s. Nobody
How shocking can it be? My God.
It's
Sex
very
has been
quaint.
there forever. Yes.
Argentina, believe it or not, Argentina became a very big place to make porno movies. And they would make them, and then they would sell them in Europe to France and England, and Russia was a big consumer.
You took the words right out of my mouth, because the very first feature porno film was Argentinian. It was called El Sartorio.
Anybody have any idea how much it costs to make these movies? Deep Throat, Behind the Green Door, Jones. What could they cost?
That ranges too. And unlike, these weren't Hollywood, so they didn't have, I don't know about Deep Throat because the Mafia was connected and did help fund some of the money. Behind the Green Door was funded by the Mitchell brothers themselves. They were not involved with the Mafia. The Mafia tried to get themselves involved after Green Door blew up. The Mitchell brothers said no, and then they got a copy of Green Door and flooded the market with a duplicate copy of Green Door so they could collect the money. Green Door was made for anywhere between $30,000 and $60,000 in 1972 money, and grossed as much as, in some reports, $60 million in 1972, 73.
And as I said, Arthur, earlier, according to Russ Meyer, he made Immoral Mr. T's for $24,000.
Yes.
And that was 1959. So, but that,
there's one other film we should mention. The same year that Midnight Cowboy was released, 1969, Andy Warhol came out with a movie called Blue Movie. And it was considered the first erotic film to get a national theatrical release. Does that come on your radar, Arthur?
No.
Yeah, I'm well aware of it because obviously I was in New York and Warhol was in New York, and I actually represented Warhol on 2 movies, which was Frankenstein and Dracula. Andy Warhol's Frankenstein, Andy Warhol's Dracula. Best thing about those movies was the title.
One was in 3D, wasn't it? Wasn't
that's
Frankenstein
right, exactly.
I like Joe D'Alessandro. I'm a big fan of his, and those films were, late Flesh, Trash, and Heat. That trilogy with Paul Morrissey. Those are pretty scandalous too in terms of sex and showing full frontal male nudity. I mean, that's the thing, is that you can show full frontal female nudity and it gets an R rating, but if you show full frontal male nudity,
can't do that.
Yeah.
Jared, what to your knowledge was Russ Meyer's most successful film?
I don't know. I don't know for sure, but it was. I know Beyond the Valley of the Dolls made a lot of money. I know Vixen made a lot of money, and
we had a movie called Up.
Whatever.
Edie
Williams had her couple of years of fame.
She was married to him, I think.
Yes.
Weren't they married? Yeah, she was in.
She was another one of those women who were famous for being famous.
In New York, it was really interesting because there were a lot of movie theaters in the 70s showing these kind of films right on Broadway, right in the heart. I mean, you had the World Theater, you had the Circus Cinema, you had the 55th Street Playhouse, you had Pussycat Cinemas. They were all over. George M. Cohan's theater became the Globe, then it became the New York. Of course, right now it's a Starbucks, but that's not surprising. But at that time, they were showing these porn movies, and that was 42nd Street and Broadway.
Yeah, but a true story in Boston, you might appreciate this, Jared. I don't know if you were there at the time, but there was a theater in downtown Boston that played Mary Poppins, hugely successful. Time goes by, and that theater develops to become a sex theater, or playing these kind of movies. So the people at Walt Disney, because they wanted to do everything that Walt wanted them to do, said they told the people in Boston, we want the same theaters on bedknobs and broomsticks as we played with Mary Poppins, only the best. So instead of telling them, look, it's not that way, that just tell them to put money into it, we'll fix it up. We want the same theaters. So they opened bedknobs and broomsticks, and when it opened at noontime, there were like 52 guys standing in front of there with raincoats.
Yeah. Well, it has
bedknobs and broomsticks. True story.
It has kind of a interesting title. One movie I remember from this period was a 3D movie called The Stewardesses, and that was a big hit. It was
3D. Steve, wasn't it 3D?
Yes, and that was the draw, because you weren't seeing submarines and spaceships in 3D. You were seeing women's anatomy in 3D, which was a big draw.
We went to check out and see how it was doing, and we saw the manager washing the glasses so they could reuse them.
Yes, I think it was released with the ad in 3 double D.
That's good. Anyway,
this has been, Jared, this has been great. You have been a wonderful doorway.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, and we definitely want to promote your book. Tell us the title of the book again, please.
Sure. It's called Pure: The Sexual Revolutions of Marilyn Chambers. It's published by Head Press, so you can get it at headpress.com, or you can get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever you buy books.
That's fabulous.
Wherever books are sold.
That's right.
Are you working on a new book?
I have a lot of ideas. It's definitely going to be nonfiction. I love pop culture, so it's probably going to have some Hollywood angle, but I haven't settled on one just yet. So,
well, we are now turning it over to Mike Faber, because he is going to lead us to our ending. Jared, thank you for a wonderful interview.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jared.
Thanks for listening to the Tales from Hollywoodland podcast. Always remember, we couldn't do this without you. We want to hear from you guys, so please write us anytime at talesfromhollywoodland.com. Remember, you could also find Tales from Hollywoodland wherever fine podcasts are found, and now you could even find us up on our new YouTube channel at no extra cost. If you made it this far into the episode, why not subscribe and give us a thumbs up? If you're into social media, you could also find us up on Instagram and Facebook. Before we get out of here, let's find out what the guys got going on with their shows this week. Julian, what are we talking about this week?
We've got David Hyde Pierce talking about many things, including Frasier and how he got that job, but quite an erudite, intelligent fellow, and I did my best to keep up.
Awesome. Steve, what do you got going on Saturday night?
Well, we are dark this week because of the holiday, but I have an upcoming interview, and I'll let you know more about it, with George Shakiris from West Side Story fame, and he's going to be a lot of fun. I want to also talk to him about some of the movies we don't remember as well, like Kings of the Sun and Flight from Ashia.
Awesome. And Arthur, what do we got going on with our show next week?
We're going to be talking about science fiction again. we're doing a sequel to our first show, which is very popular several months ago. And we're doing science fiction as of the 70s, Steve, is that right?
Post-1970s.
There we are.
Awesome. Well, guys, this is all you got to look forward to. That's really, really awesome. On behalf of Steve, Arthur, Julian, and Jared, thanks again for listening. This is your producer and announcer, Mike Faber. We'll see you next time on Tales from Hollywoodland. Your Hollywood adventure starts here.
In the Cosmic Pizza Podcast, your pizza delivery guys,
Paul, Dan, Sean,
Casey,
serve you a slice of life. We talk to women in comedy, voice actors, directors, producers, and authors.
We also talk about conspiracy theories, our top 3 films of the decade, famous people we confuse with each other, and our favourite stand-up comedians.
We've recast Star Trek and Babylon 5 and created alternate superheroes.
But most of all, we have had so much fun doing it every 2 weeks.
2 weeks! Cosmic Pizza Podcast is not about the cosmos or pizza.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping at the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.